Good afternoon. Welcome to the Analyst. Today we'll be taking up 7 newspaper articles from the Hindu and the Indian Express and discussing them. The handout for the same will be available in the description of this video for your kind perusal. Please have a look at that. The first article that we'll take up is related to the reforms in the banking sector, as India aims to have one or two public sector banks in the world's 20 biggest banks by 2047. The second article is related to intellectual property rights, as the Prime Minister observed that to curb intellectual piracy, we can digitize the manuscripts. Additionally, we'll take up 5 articles in the simplified section which will be helpful for your prelims and mains preparation. The first article is related to the reforms in the banking sector. As India aims to have one or two public sector banks in the world's 20 biggest banks by 2047. Currently, SBI is the only public sector bank in the world's top 100. It is ranked at 43rd place in terms of its asset size. So we will discuss the challenges in the banking sector, the initiatives taken by the government to reform the banking sector, the recommendations of some committees, and a few suggestions in this regard. This is important in GS3 under the topic Indian economy and issues related to planning, mobilization of resources, growth, development, and employment. First, let's understand the structure of the banking system in India. RBI is at the top of the structure and acts as the Central Bank of India. Then there are scheduled banks and unscheduled banks. The scheduled banks are those banks which are listed in the Schedule 2 of the RBI Act. They abide by the minimum requirements of RBI. For example, they need to have a minimum paid up capital and minimum reserves that they need to maintain. And the scheduled commercial banks, they can be public sector banks, regional rural banks, or private sector banks. The scheduled commercial public sector banks, they are the SBI Group, the SBI and its associate, and the other nationalized banks. The nationalization of banks in India, it started in 1969 through the initiatives of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi at that time, and then it happened in 1980 also, when 6 more banks were nationalized in India, including Oriental Bank of Commerce, Punjab and Sindh Bank, etc. Then there are regional rural banks. The regional rural banks, they are owned in a combined manner by the Ministry of Finance, a sponsoring bank, and the state governments, in the ratio of 50%, 35% and 15%. That is, the regional rural banks, their 50% stake is owned by the Ministry of Finance, 35% stake by a sponsoring bank, and 15% stake by the state governments. And the regional rural banks, they were established in India since 1975 to ensure that the banking needs in the rural areas are also met and to promote the banking in the rural areas. And they are regulated by the RBI and supervised by NABARD. Then there are private sector banks, which can be Indian banks and foreign banks. The Indian private sector banks can be like ICICI Bank, HDFC Bank, and the foreign banks are those banks which have a base elsewhere but they are also having operations in India, for example Citibank, Standard Chartered Bank, etc. Then there are cooperative banks also. The cooperative banks are those banks which are owned, managed and run by the cooperative members themselves. That is, they are themselves the depositors as well as the borrowers from the banks, and they borrow from the bank from the pool that they have collected, so as per their own needs, as per their own interests. And the cooperative banks can be the state cooperative banks, central cooperative banks, and the primary agriculture credit societies at the district level also. Then there are some other banks, for example the development banks. The development banks are those banks which provide long-term financing, even technical assistance also for particular segments, for example in agriculture sector or for land, etc. The examples of development banks are NABARD, SIDBI, Small Industries Development Bank of India, IDBI, Industries Development Bank of India. Then there are some differentiated banks also. The concept of differentiated banks in India was introduced by the RBI after the recommendations of Nachiket Moore committee. The differentiated banks can be small finance banks, The small finance banks example, for example, the AU Small Finance Bank, the Ujjivan Small Finance Bank, they provide the financial services and also the deposit and the lending facilities as well. Then there are payment banks also, for example, the Airtel Payments Bank, India Post Payment Bank, they provide the remittance services, mobile banking, mobile wallets, etc. Then there are non-banking financial companies as well. They are not banks, but they also provide financial services as well. And they are registered therefore as companies under the Companies Act. Now, what is the significance of the banking sector for ensuring economic growth in the country? The banking sector sets off a virtuous cycle in the economy. The banks, they give credits to the companies, to businesses, to various sectors in the economy. The companies in turn go for further investments, capacity expansion, which leads to employment generation, which leads to more production in the economy, more consumption also because of the rise in the incomes, rise in the salaries. Therefore, it sets off a virtuous economic cycle. For example, in the agriculture sector itself, there has been credit growth. The agriculture credit in fiscal year 2021 was close to 13 lakh crore, which has now surpassed 20 lakh crores annually. Likewise, the banking sector ensures the financial stability in the economy because they give loans. Those loans can become bad loans also. Their recovery rate determines the asset quality of the banks. If the asset quality becomes poor, more loans that the banks have advanced become bad loans, they become NPAs, then it may lead to even the collapse of the banking system, collapse of the economy also. Therefore, the NPAs, the non-performing assets, they have to be managed because the rise in the NPAs can also affect the liquidity in the market as well. And the NPAs for the public sector banks, they have been brought down and they are close to 2.58% as of March 2025. Similarly, the banking sector plays a role in the digital transformation of the economy and also ensuring financial inclusion. For example, the UPI payments in fiscal year 2025 have surpassed 200 lakh crore. And the banks also play a role in the development of the capital market as well. For example, the number of IPOs, the initial public offerings that are listed in India, are increasing year by year. And in fiscal year 2025 itself, about 80 main board IPOs were listed. And the banks, they provide the services for them also, for example, the demat accounts. Similarly, the banking sector also helps in the implementation of the welfare schemes. For example, the opening of the Jan Dhan Yojana accounts. The Jan Dhan Yojana accounts, out of that, more than 50% account holders are women. And the banking sector also advances credit to the MSMEs, micro, small and medium enterprises, and therefore provide the entrepreneurship support also. Now, when we look at the facts regarding the banking sector in India, the growth in the deposits has been there, but the growth has been comparatively stagnant in the past 2 fiscal years, probably because of more investment avenues available and the Indian depositors going for other avenues, for example, investing in mutual funds, stock markets, etc. When we look at the deposits, in comparison of the public sector and private sector, then the deposits in the public sectors have been more than the private sector, but the growth rate of the deposits in the private sector has been more than the growth rate of the deposits in the public sector banks. Now, what are the challenges in the banking sector in India? The first challenge is that of non-performing assets. The banks give credit, they give loans, but some of them can become bad loans if they are not returned by the borrowers. And if the loan recovery rate is poor, it adversely affects the asset quality of the bank. For example, the assets for which the interest and the principal amount is overdue for more than 90 days, it is classified as a non-performing asset, as an NPA. The NPAs, although they have been brought down from about 9% for the public sector banks in 2021 to about 2.5%, but it still remains high. Another challenge is that of low capital adequacy. The Indian banks, they follow the CAR norms, the capital adequacy ratio, which is the ratio between the tier 1 capital plus tier 2 capital of the bank to the risk weighted assets of the bank. The tier 1 capital means
the paid up capital, the shareholders equity, the statutory reserves for which immediate liquidity is available and it can be calculated easily. The tier 2 capital includes the undisclosed reserves, the general provisions, the preference shares for which immediate calculation may not be done easily and also immediate liquidity may not be available. A high capital adequacy ratio points to strong fundamentals, good asset quality for the bank, which is not there in the case of Indian public sector banks. Another challenge is governance issues. There are facing the issues of political interference, the interference in appointments. They have limited autonomy in their functioning. Another challenge is the dependence upon the government. The public sector banks, they are dependent upon the government for the recapitalization needs. And from fiscal year 16 to fiscal year 2021, almost 3 lakh crore were utilized by the government for the recapitalization of the public sector banks, but that also proved to be inadequate. Another challenge is that of a low credit to GDP ratio in the Indian banking system in India. The total credit that the banks give, that amounts to about 50% of India's GDP. Whereas in the advanced economies, in the Western nations, even in China also, in some countries, the credit to GDP ratio is more than 100%. That is, the total credit that is given by the banks in that country, in that economy, is more than the GDP of that country itself. Another issue is the sectoral gaps in the credit also, that there are some sectors which do not get enough credit in the Indian economy. For example, the MSMEs. As per the report of a Lok Sabha Standing Committee in 2022, the MSMEs have unmet credit needs to the tune of 25 trillion rupees in India. They need that much credit more, and it is accounting for almost 47% of their total borrowings. Additionally, the banks face the cybersecurity risks also. They need to protect their data as well. The government came up with the Indradhanush plan earlier to protect the banking sector and to ensure reforms in the banking sector. For that, the Bank Board Bureau was set up. The role of the Bank Board Bureau was to recommend for the appointments for the higher posts in the banking sector and also provide strategic advice. So the Indradhanush plan was providing the role in the appointments, capital infusion, as well as the governance reforms, but the capitalization proved to be inadequate. It also wanted to de-stress the banking sector, but more stress was introduced in the banking because of the RBI guidelines on the provisioning that they need to maintain, and even in the appointments also various vacancies remained on the bank boards as well. Now, what are the initiatives that have been taken up by the government to promote the reforms in the banking sector in India? Apart from the Indradhanush plan, the government went for the recapitalization of the banks. For example, in 2017, it came up with the proposal to recapitalize the public sector banks with 2.1 lakh crore rupees. Additionally, the government amalgamated various public sector banks. The mergers happened, the mergers of various banks with the State Bank of India, and it led to various benefits. For example, removing the redundancies. For example, if four banks are having four independent branches in the same area, and if all four are merged into one bank, then one single branch will suffice for that area. It also helped them in achieving the economy of scale, removing the inefficiencies in their functioning. And the government conducted the Gyan Sangams. They were the meetings where proposals were discussed for the governance reforms in the public sector banks. The government introduced the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. This code ensured faster resolution of the non-performing assets for the stressed assets. It led to the release of capital and therefore the availability of more liquidity, therefore ensuring the credit discipline among the banks also. And the government went for the construction of the National Asset Reconstruction Company. This exists to complement the other existing asset reconstruction companies. It is to take over 15 large loans in India amounting to 50,000 crores. It will help the banks because then the banks will be able to focus upon their core activities, the lending activity, and it will be going for the asset reconstruction recovery in place of the banks. Additionally, the government promoted the digital banking also. The digital banking, for example, the promotion of the unified payments interface, the UPI payments, the e-rupee, which is a QR based e-voucher, and additionally the plans for a central bank digital currency, an e-rupee, floating of an e-rupee, and digital banking units which are being promoted by the government. Additionally, for the resolution of the stressed assets, there was the enactment of the SARFAESI Act, securitization of assets and reconstruction of the financial assets and enforcement of securities interest 2002, and the debt recovery tribunals. The pecuniary jurisdiction of the debt recovery tribunals has been increased now from 10 lakh rupees to 20 lakh rupees. Additionally, there is the prudential framework, the norms which are given by the RBI, the prudential norms. And the banking sector in India follows the Basel norms. The Basel norms were introduced by the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. First, the Basel I norms were introduced, which focused upon the credit risk. Therefore, they prescribed the capital adequacy ratio of minimum 8% of the risk weighted assets for the bank, and out of that total 8%, minimum 4% should be held in terms of the tier 1 capital of the bank itself. The Basel II norms further expanded the scope, broadened the scope. Rather than focusing only upon the credit risk, it went for all the three pillars: the credit risk, and also the market risk, and the operational risk. And therefore, apart from the car norms which were continued, there was the introduction of the supervisory review to introduce the managing and monitoring of the stressed assets and to also ensure the market discipline. The Basel III norms further prescribe that the total tier 1 and tier 2 assets should be more than 10.5% of the risk weighted assets of the bank. Now let's also discuss the recommendations of a few committees for reforms in the banking sector in India. Initially, there was the establishment of the Narasimhan Committee. The Narasimhan Committee, one in 1991, recommended that we can reduce the statutory liquidity ratio and the cash reserve ratio. The cash reserve ratio means a certain proportion of the total deposits that the bank has, it has to maintain in terms of liquid cash, either liquid cash or deposits with the RBI. And the statutory liquidity ratio means a certain proportion of the net demand and time liabilities of the bank it has to maintain in terms of liquid reserves, for example cash, gold, or it can buy the government securities. Now if we reduce the statutory liquidity ratio and cash reserve ratio, it will improve the liquidity and therefore benefit the banks. Additionally, the Narasimhan Committee recommended that the government interference should be brought down, and even the recapitalization should happen for the weak banks. It also recommended the establishment of a asset reconstruction bank so that the stressed assets they can be reconstructed and the value can be extracted from them. The Narasimhan Committee too in 1998 recommended that we can go for structural reforms. Structural reforms, for example, reducing the government stake in the banks to less than 33%, and also introduce the prudential norms. Prudential norms, for example, the NPA classification that should be brought down from 180 days to 90 days. At that time it was 180 days, that is the assets for which the interest and principal amount were due for more than 180 days, that was classified as the non-performing asset. Additionally, the Narasimhan Committee too recommended that we can follow the international accounting standards, that is there should be risk-based supervision. More risky the asset, more supervision should be there, more caution, more prudence should be employed. The PJ Nayak Committee recommended that again the government can reduce its stake in the banks. For example, the PJ Nayak Committee recommended that the government stake should be less than 50%. It also recommended the establishment of a bank investment company, as it had proposed that initially the banks can be run through the bank board bureaus, but later on they can be taken over by the bank investment company, which may be run by the managers. And additionally, for the governance reforms, it recommended that we can split the posts of the chairman and the managing directors. They should not be the same person. For the public sector banks, the chairman should be separate and the managing director should be separate, and additionally there should be a fixed 5-year term also, as per PJ Nayak Committee. The Nachiket More Committee recommended that we can open the payment banks, the differentiated banks, because that will lead to further financial inclusion, and hence it also recommended the opening of even a universal electronic bank account, that every Indian more than 18 years of age should have access to an independent bank account. And the HR Khan committee recommended that RBI should also focus upon one of its core roles, the inflation targeting, and therefore the monetary policy transmission should happen. RBI should ensure that, for example, when the repo rate is reduced, then the bank should also reduce the interest rates at which they are advancing the loans. Additionally, there was the 4R framework which was proposed, that is recognition, the early recognition of the stressed assets, recapitalization, the recapitalization of the public sector banks so that they have enough capital available and they can go aggressively after the loan recovery as well as the lending also, the resolution, that is faster resolution of the stressed assets so that the liquidity can be improved and the capital which is stuck can be freed, and the reforms as well in the banking sector. Now, what are the suggestions that we can give for further reforms in the banking sector in India? For the governance related reforms and for increasing the autonomy in decision making for the public sector banks, we can say that the recommendations of the PJ Nayak committee should be implemented. For example, reducing the government stake in public sector banks to less than 50%. Additionally, we can go for privatization and further consolidation. For example, the weak banks should be recapitalized and the strong banks should be consolidated, and the credit flow should happen to the priority sector lending areas and also to MSMEs. The banks can utilize technology and go for innovation in products and services. For example, the usage of AI, the chatbots in the financial services, and also the usage of big data, etc. And we can also go for the promotion of the bond market in India. The advanced countries, the USA, etc., there the bond market is well developed, and the large corporates, rather than going for the loans from the banks, they float the corporate bonds also. And even the junk bonds, the low quality, poor quality bonds also get subscribed in countries like USA. We can also promote the improvements in the bond market in India. We can also go for the promotion of niche banking, the banking for specialized products and services, and also the development finance, for example, the development financial institutions, the DFIs. Also, the banks should be discouraged from going for the lazy banking. Lazy banking means that they prioritize the lending to the well-known, to large corporations where they find stability, surety, and guaranteed returns. They go for profitability. So rather than going for lazy banking, they should go for the innovations in the products and services that they provide. Now, there is a mains practice question also. Despite significant growth, the Indian banking system continues to face structural challenges. Examine the major challenges faced by the banking sector in India. Discuss the recent reform initiatives undertaken to address these issues. Please try to write it. The next article is related to intellectual property rights. As Prime Minister Modi observed that we need to curb intellectual piracy, and for that we can digitize our manuscripts. So we will discuss the need for intellectual property rights in India, the issues in the IPR regime in India, and the national IPR policy. This is important in GS3 under the topic issues related to intellectual property rights. First, what are intellectual properties? Intellectual properties are intangible creations. Intangible creations of the human intellect. They can be in the form of inventions, literary and artistic works, designs and symbols, or even names and images. Names and images used by businesses or in commerce. They are protected under Article 27. Article 27 of the UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The intellectual property rights regime started in the world through two conventions. The two conventions under WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Rights Organization, and they are Paris Convention for the Protection of Industrial Property 1883 and the Berne Convention for the Protection of Literary and Artistic Works 1886. Additionally, there is the TRIPS, which is under the aegis of WTO, that is trade related aspects of intellectual property rights. When we look at the World Intellectual Property Organization report 2024, India's ranking in the Global Innovation Index has improved to 39th place out of 133 economies in 2024. The patent filings in India have been growing as compared to 2023. There was a 15% growth in 2024. The industrial design applications which have been submitted also grew by 36%, and India is fourth globally in the number of trademark filings. Now, what is the need of IPR? Why do we need to protect the intellectual property rights? Because they will encourage the innovation. If the intellectual property rights are not protected, then the companies will not be encouraged in investing in the research and development, because whatever they come up with, whatever research results are, everybody else will be using them. If their rights are not protected, if they are not patented, if they do not get royalty, then they do not have the incentive to invest in research, and it will promote the economic growth in India. For example, more research and development will create more jobs. Ultimately, it will create jobs, for example, in sectors like the pharma sector, which is a growing and sunrise sector in India. And the rights of the creators will also be protected. The ease of doing business will also be ensured, as we will be in compliance with the global norms, for example, the norms of the TRIPS. And also it will ensure technology transfer to India as well, because the foreign companies, the foreign investors, they are wary of their technology being copied and their intellectual properties not being respected, not being protected. If we have an IPR regime, then they will be able to confidently transfer their technology to their Indian partners, and therefore it will promote the foreign direct investment also. It will promote the setting up of joint ventures as well between the Indian companies and the foreign companies. Now, what are the various kinds of intellectual property rights? The rights can be in the form of copyright, patent, trademark, industrial design, trade secret, or even GI tags, etc. Now, the copyrights are usually awarded either for artistic works or literary works or intangible works. For example, musical compositions, photos, videos, movies, books. The authors can get their books also copyrighted. In India, the copyright is protected under the Copyright Act of 1957. Then there is the patent, which is also a form of intellectual property. The patents are usually awarded for protecting the innovations, for protecting the inventions of a person, that it amounts to his intellectual property. In India, there are certain criteria for awarding a patent. For example, it should be novel, that there should be an element of novelty. It should not be there in the prior knowledge earlier, and it should be non-obvious, that there should be an element of non-obviousness, that a person who is having the skills in the relevant field should not consider it as obvious. It should be discoverable after the technical competence and after the technical advancement only. And additionally, there should be the industrial use also, which should be possible for that product. Then the patent can be awarded. In India, the patents are protected under the Act of 1970, Patent Act 1970. Then there is the awarding of trademarks also. The trademarks are usually given for the logos or the trademark of that particular company. It is also protected in India under the Trademark Act of 1999. Additionally, there is the awarding of industrial designs also. They are also protected in India under the Designs Act of 2000. The industrial designs can be in the form of any shape, color which may be protected, or a particular aesthetic design, aesthetic appeal. They are all protected under the industrial designs under the Designs Act 2000. Another intellectual property right is in the form of trade secrets. The trade secrets are not protected under any specific law in India, but the trade secrets can be in terms of the marketing strategy, promotion strategy, the list of the vendors and suppliers. They all amount to trade secrets which should be protected. Additionally, there can be the geographical indicators also. They are also protected under the GI Act 1999. They amount to the specific reference of a product, that it belongs to a particular region only. It is having the distinct characteristics, and therefore it can be easily differentiated from the products whose source, whose origin may be from a different region. So the government came up with the National Intellectual Property Rights Policy 2016, for which the implementation is overseen by the Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion. It functions as the nodal department. The Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion itself functions under the Ministry of Commerce, Government of India, and this policy is in compliance with the WTO TRIPS agreement, the WTO trade related aspects of intellectual property rights. And the theme is Creative India, Innovative India. To ensure the implementation monitoring of the policy, the cell for IPR promotion and management functions as the single point of reference for the implementation of the objectives of the policy. Now, what are the objectives of the IPR policy? It is to create the IPR awareness, the awareness for the intellectual property rights, and not to infringe them is promoted through the outreach and the promotion of the IPR. And there is the generation of IPRs also, which is promoted to encourage the innovations simultaneously, and the policy aims to put in place a legal framework, a legislative framework for the protection of the IPRs comprehensively in India. The commercialization of the IPRs is also promoted, and the enforcement and adjudication should be done for the intellectual property rights in India, and therefore the infringement of the IPR should be curbed. The human capital development is also promoted by the policy by building resources, capacity building, enhancement of the skills for the IPR protection in India. But there are certain issues in the intellectual property rights regime in India. For example, the Section 3D of the Patents Act 1970 as amended in 2005. As per the Section 3D of the Patents Act, the patents can be refused in case there is a case of evergreening of the patents. For example, if a company goes for the filing of a fresh patent when the earlier patent is about to expire, citing that now they have come up with a new innovation, new invention by going for just a slight change in the composition of a drug, then that can be refused. For example, the Indian Patent Office refused to give patent to the drug of Novartis, the Gleevec drug, citing that this is a case of evergreening of patent. Therefore, unless there is a significant difference in the efficacy, significant difference in the therapeutic efficacy of the drug, then by going for a minor composition change of the drug, the patent cannot be awarded. There has to be a significant difference in the efficacy also. Additionally, there is the issue of compulsory licensing. The Section 84 of the Patent Act, through that the Government of India can award a compulsory license to any entity for the sale, purchase, manufacture, import, production of any drug, any component also. And this affects the interests of the patent owners, because this can be done even without the consent of the patent owners. Therefore, the foreign companies, they are wary of these provisions, and they are losing out upon the royalties in case the compulsory licenses are awarded by the government. Although this is compliant with the WTO TRIPS regime, it is allowed under the trade related aspects of intellectual property rights regime of the WTO also, which allows for compulsory licenses in case there is a national emergency, extreme urgency, or there is a case of anti-competitive behavior, it can be awarded. Another issue is the priority watch list, which is published by the US Trade Representative. Under the USTR, it is usually alleged that in India there is an infringement of the intellectual property rights. Another issue is data exclusivity also. The foreign companies, even the Indian companies also demand that there should be a data exclusivity law in India. That is, they generate some data, test data, for example, while testing their drugs, while they are going for the research purposes, they submit this data to the government for getting the market approval, for getting the approval to release that drug in the market. But that data may be utilized by the other entities also. So the money, the fund that they have put in for the research, that goes down the drain in case they are not getting the patent for that, in case that data is accessible by the other companies also. Then the enforcement of the Copyright Act in India has also been allegedly a little lax, and there is the protection of traditional knowledge also, which is required, for example, through the effective utilization of the traditional knowledge digital libraries as well. Now, there is a mains practice question also. With India aspiring to become a knowledge-based economy, the role of IPR has become increasingly critical. Discuss the need for a strong IPR framework and examine the key issues in India's IPR regime. Please try to write it. The next article is related to the right to information and the right to deny information. As the Digital Personal Data Protection Law has amended the Section 8 Clause 1 Clause J of the RTI Act. This is important in GS2 under the topic Important Aspects of Governance, Transparency and Accountability, and also in GS4 under the topic Information Sharing and Transparency in Government and the Right to Information. Before coming to the article, let's have a look at the Section 8 of the RTI Act. The Section 8 of the RTI Act provided for certain exemptions, that certain information is exempted from disclosure even if an RTI application is filed. Earlier, it provided that there shall be no obligation upon the public information officers to disclose any information to any citizen if it relates to the personal information of a person, personal information the disclosure of which has no relation with any public activity or interest. That is, we cannot seek information, personal information of an individual if it is not related to the public interest or public activity, and it may amount to the unwarranted invasion of the privacy of the individual. It even provided that any information which can be shared with the parliament or state legislature shall not be denied to any citizen if an RTA application is filed. But now the Digital Personal Data Protection Act has amended this section, Section 8 Clause 1 Clause J of the RTI Act. Now it has deleted the remaining provision and kept only this much, that the information which relates to personal information may not be disclosed. Now the earlier safeguard that was there, that the personal information can also be disclosed if it is in the public interest, in the public activity, that may be disclosed. Now that safeguard is no more there. So any information which is personal information may be refused from disclosure under the RTI Act now, after the Digital Personal Data Protection Act, which amended the RTI Act. This has led to concerns that it may lead to the dilution of the RTI Act. Let's also have a look at some of the observations regarding the RTI Act earlier. The report of the group of experts on privacy in 2012, of which Justice A.P. Shah was also a member, observed that any legislation on privacy should not circumscribe the RTI Act. The RTI Act should not be circumscribed, should not be restricted by any legislation, any law on privacy. The Sri Krishna Committee in 2018 observed that there should be narrow exemptions only, that the non-disclosure should be permitted only if the disclosure may lead to grave harm such as identity theft, blackmail or discrimination, etc. Otherwise, it should be in the open domain. The Joint Parliamentary Committee 2021, while reviewing the Data Protection Bill, had not recommended any amendment to the RTI Act, but still it was done. Even Justice Khanna had observed in CPIO versus Subhash Chandra Agarwal case that we can have an indicative list of what would form part of the personal information, for example, name or family status or the medical records, etc. And the protection should be provided only when there is a stipulation of larger public interest which is satisfied, that the disclosure is in the public interest, then the disclosure should happen. Now coming to the article, there are a few issues with this. For example, the definition of personal information under the amended RTI Act, that is a subject of debate. There are two views here. One is the natural person interpretation, that the person should be understood in a general sense, a normal person, natural person, whereas the DPDP bill's definition is expansive. It includes the Hindu undivided family, a firm, company, that all amounts to personal information. If this latter definition is adopted, then almost everything will be personal information. Therefore, it is now giving a handle to the authorities to deny most information. So the author is claiming that the RTI may be turned into the right to deny information rather. Plus, there are strong penalties also which are prescribed by the Digital Personal Data Protection Law to the tune of 250 crores. This disincentivizes the public information officers from disclosing information and citing it as personal information, therefore. Now, there will be certain losses due to this. For example, the loss of public monitoring. The citizens are the best monitors against corruption, and the multi-layered agencies have failed to curb it. For example, the vigilance departments, anti-corruption bureaus, the Lokpal, they have failed as per the author to curb corruption. Another issue will be the denial of the essential information because of the broadened scope of the personal information. For example, Rajasthan shared details of pension beneficiaries to combat the ghost employees and the ghost cards. Now, such information may be restricted from disclosure in future, citing it as personal information. Therefore, the author suggests that we need to focus upon four issues. There should be an engagement between media and the citizens. There should be widespread public discussions regarding this, and there should be political accountability as well. And the public opinion is crucial for building opinion support with the media, and the gravity of this amendment should be recognized as it deserves attention, because the fundamental right to information may be compromised because of this. The next article is related to the Tadoba, Andheri, Pench and the Sahyadri tiger reserves. This is important in GS3 under the topic environment conservation. First, let's discuss about the Tadoba Andheri Tiger Reserve. This is the largest and oldest tiger reserve of Maharashtra. It derives its name after the god Tadoba and the Andheri river which passes through it. The reserve comprises of the Tadoba National Park and the Andheri Wildlife Sanctuary. The corridor has linkages with the Navegaon Nagzira and the Pench tiger reserves as well. This is located in the central plateau province of the Deccan Peninsula. Now, what is the vegetation which is there? It comprises of majorly southern tropical dry deciduous vegetation, and there are also two lakes in the tiger reserve, the Tadoba Lake and the Kolsa Lake. The flora in the tiger reserve comprises of the teak trees, crocodile bark, salai, tendu, maua, maduka, etc. And the fauna in the tiger reserve comprises of tiger, leopard, sloth bear, wild dog, gore, cheetal and sambar. Now coming to the Pench Tiger Reserve, this is located near the southern reaches of the Satpura Hills in Madhya Pradesh, and it also shares the southern boundary with Maharashtra. In 1983, it was declared a national park. In 1992, it became a tiger reserve. The Pench river passes through the Pench Tiger Reserve, and it comprises of the Indra Priyadarshini Pench National Park and Pench Mowgli Sanctuary as well. The real story of the Rudyard Kipling's famous book, The Jungle Book, also is regarding the area near the Pench Tiger Reserve. And the vegetation in the Pench Tiger Reserve comprises majorly of the moist sheltered valley to an open dry deciduous forest. The flora in the Pench Tiger Reserve comprises of teak, sag, maua, grasses, shrubs and even bamboo plantations are also there in the Pench Tiger Reserve. The fauna comprises of cheetal, sambar, nilgai, gore, that is Indian bison and wild boar. There are predators also there, including tiger, leopard, wild dogs and wolf, and there are more than 325 species of resident and migratory bird species, including the Malabar pied hornbill, the Indian pitta, osprey, grey-headed fishing eagle and white-eyed buzzard. Coming to the Sahyadri Tiger Reserve, it is located in the Sahyadri ranges of the Western Ghats of Maharashtra. It is the northernmost tiger habitat in the Western Ghats. It comprises of the Koina Wildlife Sanctuary and the Chandoli National Park, both of which were combined to form the Sahyadri Tiger Reserve in 2007. The Tiger Reserve comprises of the Shiv Sagar Reservoir of the Koina River and also the Vasant Sagar Reservoir on the Varanga River. The history of the Sahyadri Tiger Reserve goes long back, as many forts were built in the region or captured by the first Maratha Emperor Shivaji Bhosle. And it is also believed that the temple, the legendary temple from which Shivaji Bhosle received the Bhavani sword from divine providence, is also located. The ruins of that temple are also located in the Sahyadri Tiger Reserve. The habitat of the Sahyadri Tiger Reserve comprises of barren, rocky and lateritic plateaus. They are locally known as sadas. There is less perennial vegetation there. There are little chances of adverse anthropogenic influence in the region. Therefore, chances of it remaining protected are high in the future also. The flora of the tiger reserve comprises of moist evergreen, semi-evergreen, moist and dry deciduous vegetation. It even has the medicinal and fruit-bearing trees and even commercial hardwood trees. The fauna in the tiger reserve comprises of both the carnivores and the herbivores. The carnivores like tiger, leopard, wolf, jackal and wild dog are found there. The herbivores including barking deer, sambar, Indian bison, sloth bear, mouse deer, giant Indian squirrel and macaque are found in the tiger reserve. Now, coming to the article, there is a proposal to translocate the tigers to the Sahyadri Tiger Reserve. Despite the rich forest vegetation, the tiger population in the Sahyadri Tiger Reserve have remained largely transient. Now, by December, two tigresses will be translocated to the Sahyadri Tiger Reserve from the Tadoba Tiger Reserve. The next article is related to ease of doing science. This is important in GS3 under the topic Achievement of Indians in Science and Technology and Indigenization of Technology. When we look at the current research standing of India, India only accounts for just 2.5% of the highly cited research papers. India has only 2% of the scientists in the global top 2% of the most cited researchers, and India is in the top 5 in 29 out of 44 critical technologies. And simultaneously there are restrictions from the other countries, like the explicit and implicit restrictions on the high technology exports from the USA and China. Therefore there is an ecosystem gap. We lack a comprehensive strategy to attract and retain the top tier researchers. We have an urgent need for focusing upon some domains, for example the defining domains like semiconductors, propulsion, synthetic biology, quantum communication. This will ensure that we have strategic autonomy in the future because we will have an edge in the critical technologies. The author claims that currently there is a global opportunity for talent acquisition. Because of the dynamics of USA, for example, the Trump administration has cut the budgets more than 50% for the US federal science bodies, and only 15% of the science, technology, engineering, management PhDs secure the tenure track jobs in USA in less than 5 years. Simultaneously, the USA has also tightened the visa regimes, therefore the Indian PhD scholars remain stranded. We can attract them and retain them. Europe has been going for a recruiting. They have come up with a program like Choose Europe for Science Conference. France has gone for establishment of 100 million euro fund to attract global researchers. Similarly, China is going for talent acquisition. For example, the Young 1000 Talents program of China, they have recruited 3500 early career scientists, which has led to a dramatic rise in the research outputs from China. And they are researching on areas like advanced aircraft engines production, where there is 4 times more high impact research than USA. So what initiatives has the government of India taken? We have also committed for large scale mission oriented investments. For example, the large scale investments through Anusandhan National Research Foundation, the establishment of 1 lakh crore Research and Development Innovation Fund, the measures for promoting ease of doing science. But there is a missing piece in the puzzle. We are not able to attract and retain top talent, as the compensation in India for scientists, that is uncompetitive, non-competitive as compared to the global peers. We have a scarcity of world-class labs. The sustained research grants are absent. The predictable research grants are not there. There are no clear pathways for the long-term absorption or the career progression of the top-tier scientists. And the recruitment is also not tied to mission-oriented research streams. So the author proposes a solution: the establishment of focused research organizations. The author proposes that they can be established in the frontier domains where the sovereign capability is needed, and they can be existed within the existing institutes of national importance. We can have a target of attracting 500 top class researchers in the next 5 years, and we can also target the early career talent, for example new professors, postdoctoral researchers. And we can also structure the focused research organizations as Section 8 companies with at least 51% industry participation. They can also be made as permanent institutional structures. They should not be like ad hoc schemes. They should have long-term continuity, and there should be predictable funding for them. The author gives an example also. For example, the IIT Delhi has collaborated with DRDO on the quantum communication development, and there are certain principles which are followed. For example, the competitive compensation. The industry and the state resources are pooled, and the compensation which is given to the researchers is competitive. Another principle is strategic direction, that there is a focus upon select critical areas only rather than spreading out the focus thinly over multiple areas. There is a hybrid ecosystem, that is convergence of global expertise, indigenous knowledge, and also the industry resources also. Plus, there is the establishment of permanent structures, that is overcoming the short-term nature of the schemes, the ad hocism. The next article is related to the issues in Manipur. As Prime Minister Modi is going to visit Manipur, there are 5 key issues in the conflict-ridden state. This is important in GS3 under the topic internal security. The main issues in Manipur include the rehabilitation of the displaced population. More than 57,000 people are internally displaced in Manipur. They are living in more than 280 relief camps. Many of them are living there for more than 2 years now. And there are two categories of displacement. One, who are displaced from those locations where the other community is in majority. For example, the Kuki-Jo people who are displaced from the Imphal Valley where they are in minority, and the Metis displaced from the hill towns where they are in minority, the hill towns like More, Chudachandpur. And then another category of displacement is those people who are displaced from the fringe areas at the valley hill frontier, because there have been attacks there in the past, or there is an apprehension of the attacks in the future. And for that, the government came up with a 3-phase resettlement plan also in July. That is to wind down all the relief camps by the end of the year, but there has been limited progress in this regard. And for that, first resettling the fringe areas, displaced people, then in the others in the prefabricated houses. Another issue is the free movement in the state. Now the boundaries between the valley and the hill areas have become hardened. Therefore, the travel has become unsafe for both the communities, Metis and the Kukijos. And there are heavily manned buffer zones, they are heavily armed also. The Metis are therefore unable to leave the central valley, and hence they lack the access to highways which are controlled by the Kukijo groups. The Kukijos in turn have no access to Imphal and the airport there as well. Now the center plan was there to enforce the free movement on the highways, but it backfired. There were clashes in the past. Now the Kukijo groups are allowing the movement of essential goods to the valley to ensure the survival of the Metis. Another issue is the dialogue between the two communities. More than 250 people have died in the last 1.5 years of violence, and there is an absence of any dialogue even today between them. The Ministry of Home Affairs is engaging in dialogue, but they are conducting separate talks between the Ministry of Home Affairs and the Metis, and the Ministry of Home Affairs and the Kukijo groups. There has been a suspension of the operations pact also with Kukijo insurgent groups, which was renewed. That was to ensure that the territorial integrity of Manipur is maintained. But this is contrary to the Kukijo usual demand. They demand for separate administration. They demand for establishment of the area as union territory with a legislature. But the Miti groups, they object to the suspension of Operation Pact, saying that these groups will get legitimacy if the government is negotiating with them. Another issue is the government formation also. As the former Chief Minister Biren Singh had resigned in February, and the central government had imposed in a few days the president's rule. Now the central government is continuing the imposition of president's rule, and there is a push from the valley based MLAs, the Naga MLAs, for the popular government, but the center is not willing to destabilize the current status quo. Another issue is the border situation also. The state of Manipur has a porous international border, shares its boundary with Myanmar, and the Metis, they allege that there is unregulated illegal immigration, as the ethnicity is shared between the Chin people from Myanmar and the Kukijos in Manipur. The center had decided to scrap the free movement regime and the fencing of the border between Manipur and Myanmar, but it is not so easy to do. It also has become an emotive issue for the Kukijos and the Naga communities there, because they both share close ethnic ties and economic ties. Even the United Naga Council had imposed a trade embargo as a protest against the scrapping of the free movement regime, but now it has been temporarily suspended. The next article is related to the burning of firecrackers and the right to clean air. This is important in GS2 under the topic Indian Constitution Significant Provisions. The Supreme Court has observed that why should we go for the ban on burning of firecrackers only in Delhi? Why not in the entire India? So let's have a look at the debate regarding the burning of firecrackers. There are certain problems with the burning of firecrackers. For example, it causes pollution, air pollution, noise pollution, and it even causes adverse health impact also. For example, during the times of firecracker burning, the number of cases with respiratory diseases increased by 30 to 40%. Another line of thought claims that it may affect the ban on the burning of firecrackers may affect the right to freedom of religion, because it is considered as a religious practice as well. But if it is an essential religious practice, then it has to surpass the test of essentiality. Even the right to freedom of religion is not an absolute right. There have to be qualifications imposed upon it, the reasonable restrictions imposed upon it on the grounds of public order, morality, health, etc. And simultaneously, Article 21 has to be protected, the right to life has to be protected. And we can apply the precautionary principle also in this case, as observed by the court also in the Vellore Citizen Welfare Forum case, that we cannot wait for the scientific evidence, conclusive, concrete scientific evidence to prove that it is definitely causing harm. Rather, if it is causing harm, it is environmentally damaging, then that practice can be prohibited and the burden of proof can be shifted upon the entity which is engaging in such activity. In MC Mehta versus Kamal Nath, the court had observed that certain elements of the environment have to be protected to ensure the effective enjoyment of right to life. For example, air, water, that will ensure the effective enjoyment of Article 21. And health has to take precedence over the other rights, the right to freedom of religion or the commercial rights rather. The right to health has to be ensured. The quality of life also has to be improved, and we can go for a graded reduction. Initially, a graded reduction in the firecrackers burning, for example, the allowing of the green firecrackers to be burnt rather than the usual firecrackers, and eventual prohibition also. And this should not be seen through the lens of religion. Rather, in a mature society, in a mature democracy, the changes can be encouraged using a bottom-up approach, so that prudence is used, caution is used, and there is a holistic ban which can be implemented for the firecrackers burning. For that, there simultaneously has to be the awareness spreading among the people as well. There is a PYQ also regarding the right to clean environment and the burning of firecrackers, which has been asked by UPSC earlier. Thank you.